What we're doing with this particular segment, and I've asked the panel members to give thought to what are some of the emerging topics, themes, issues, trends that might need to be part of a comp plan 2025 that maybe is not in the comp plan of 2014. So it's really a projection forward, an anticipation and forecast relative to the content of a plan based upon where we are as a locality, a nation, a state, a nation, even in thinking of worldwide considerations. As I mentioned to each of the panel members, no preparation formally necessary other than coming with a fertile mind and based upon the perspective and experience that each bring to the table. We have a mix of presenters, as you might well imagine. First will be Wayne Sillenberg. Wayne is the Director of Planning for Albemarle County. I asked each one to send me a brief bio, and I have some of them with me, and then some of them I don't know what the heck I did with them, which is not untypical of me, as many of them know. But Wayne is a Hokie in the sense that Blacksburg, he's been in enemy territory for a long time as director in Albemarle County, and prior to that, positions chief of comprehensive or community development, and now director for the jurisdiction. And I guess I'm adding up these years, my gosh, 23, 24 years now, right? 28 for the county, but beyond that, with experience elsewhere in Culpeper and then the Rappahannock, Rapidan Planning Commission, District Commission. Bruce Dotson, who is a member. Bruce is next to Missy. Missy's name, Missy Creasy, has been mentioned several times. But we'll go to Bruce and come back to Missy. Bruce is a longstanding member of the Planning Commission in Albemarle County, also a long-term member of the faculty at University of Virginia in the School of Architecture and Planning Program, long-term chair of that planning program at UVA, and Bruce was president at the creation of the Institute for Environmental Negotiations. In fact, he headed that operation for a number of years, and one of the first cases that they worked on was when I was in Blacksburg as a planning commission chairman. We were having a dispute with a land applicant, and we called on Bruce to come in and facilitate and manage us through that process. And that was a neat experience and first real opportunity for me to get to know Bruce, and I'm privileged to know him ever since. Missy is city planner for Charlottesville, I guess more formally like neighborhood services or development services. She's educated worked in Blacksburg and also interned with the town of Blacksburg. But she has been in Charlottesville now for, my gosh, you've been for quite a few years now.
It's 15.
15 years, yeah. So we appreciate Missy being with us, and Missy, of course, was the person that Elaine was referencing in terms of the collaborative exercise with Charlottesville. Genevieve Keller is a member of the Planning Commission in the city of Charlottesville, and she has been on the commission now. I want to hazard a guess, but I would say, what, your second term, right, or third term?
Well, first real term.
First real term, but you had
I think 7 years.
7 years total, yeah. So, and went through the planning commissioner program that we sponsor, and Tim Keller, right? Tim,
Yes.
related to you?
Sometimes I claim him.
Sometimes you claim him as a husband, and Tim is the Planning Commission in Albemarle County, and currently as a certified planning commissioner, of course, longtime faculty member at Iowa State University, and he and I got to know each other 20 or 30 years ago with some collaborative projects out that way. Will Cockrell, Will, good to see you, regional planner with Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, which is a multi-jurisdictional entity, and many of you know of the commission of which you're a member. Will has been with the commission for quite a few years now and has had the benefit of working in the more urban environment and the rural environment, active also in the Virginia chapter of American Planning Association, and so we're appreciative of Will giving his time to come and share some perspective. And then Vlad Gavrilovic. Vlad is principal with the Renaissance Planning Group. He heads the Charlottesville office. Vlad has worked in Northern Virginia with his own firm and has now been with Renaissance, oh gosh, I guess 7 years, and a national and scope planning consultancy, and done a lot of work in Virginia communities over the many years. And then we'll hear also from Jim Zook. Jim's got 36 years experience, as I know, 25 in Fairfax and 11 in Chesterfield, so long tenure as a planning director and experience in that field. What I've asked each of them to do is take maybe 3 to 5 minutes and just come up and give us the benefit of their thought and thinking relative to what they perceive is on the horizon. That will be an item of potential consequence and should be part of the Comp Plan 2025. After their individual presentations, there'll be discourse between them, then we're going to open it up to you, to questions, comments, and maybe even your ideas as to what should be in the plan of 2025. So Wayne, sir, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, and I guess an advantage and a curse at the same time of being the first speaker is that you can talk about most of anything and you're not repeating what someone said. But then you also have to make sure you're covering all those bases. And I will say in opening that I think that regional collaboration, the topic of the last session, is going to be very important. More important than ever as the years advance, we get into 2025 and beyond in planning, because places really are very integrated. They don't end on jurisdictional boundaries in terms of dealing with issues. I'm not probably going to say anything anyone hasn't thought about. I think there are a lot of factors and evolving issues today that will become more and more important in our planning in the future. I hope that we've in fact begun to address many of these in the planning we're doing now. We have our comprehensive plan under review with our Board of Supervisors and update. Our Planning Commission completed its work last year on that. So what I'm going to touch on is some of the things that we've seen evolving and can project maybe more specifically issues of the future as we've been doing our planning work. And I'm going to touch a lot of bases here, and I'll try to be very quick. One that I think is going to be important for the future is energy. And not only is it about where that energy source is coming from, how it's being produced, but also how it's being distributed. And I think the old question of the national grid for distribution of electricity, the sources and how you accommodate what sources of energy production there are. Geographically, it's a land use issue. It's a support for development issue. And also, I think there's an element that's local. It's about what we are doing in neighborhoods or even in individual homes that are about providing for energy needs. Generally, I think we hear about it a lot. Environment, climate change are obviously issues that are much in the news. And I think where we see the planning aspect of that is in what does that mean for what's going to be appropriate as areas to develop, and what are going to be areas to avoid. It's not just about preservation, it may be about avoidance and dealing with the effects of climate change, environmental changes, and also how buildings are built may be very different in the future based on climate impacts and environmental impacts. Evolving for us, and I think in a lot of places, is the topic of local food and local food systems and how we support ourselves more locally. We've actually tried in our planning work for a long time to look at our rural areas as not just what they can be today, but what they might be in the future. And as homes, they aren't very good in producing agricultural products. So there is an aspect that's about market demand locally, about where you can produce to meet local food needs, how you distribute that, and there's even the equity issue of who benefits, what are the costs that you might be incurring in having a more locally oriented food system. Transportation is obviously going to be a big issue. It is today, it will in the future. Some of it's of the personal aspect, the idea of smart cars, but also light systems and pedestrian systems that we plan for today, they may be much more important in the future as people look at alternatives for getting around. And there may be something else out there that we don't even know about that is of a personal transportation nature, as well as mass transportation, not just the typical buses and subways and light rail, but also the idea of smart highways that move vehicles more efficiently. The idea of sharing modes, bike sharing, car sharing. The next generation of rail. What is the next thing that we're going to see in rail transportation, high-speed rail, or new technologies? There's been the talk of maglev as an example, and other types of technologies. And if you think about where we are now, we're probably a century or so of the automobile being the center, but before that it was rail, and there was shipping and transportation on waterways, and before that the horse. So there is something out there, probably beyond where we are now, and anticipating that and planning for that is going to be important. The broadband issues we're dealing with right now in Albemarle County is a question, and really it ultimately becomes about how broadband functions for information, trade, communication, virtual transportation. I had someone tell me that transportation of the future is the internet. And equity and how that's provided. It's the question of whether or not broadband will ultimately be a utility like electricity or telephone service. And there's the distribution, how you get it to the locations it needs to be. And also, ultimately, that leads to decisions people make about where they live based on the availability of the internet and broadband services. I think there is the ethnic and generational diversity issues that we'll have to address. Some are about where people live based on ethnicity or cultural interests and the demands and expectations they place on the market and public services, but also it's going to be about my generation aging and probably living a lot longer than generations have before. The baby boomers are a big slug of the population cohorts, and where we live and how we're accommodated is going to be an issue for us generally in the nation. Our homes, the services, the health care, the impact we have on Social Security and Medicare, things that are going to have to be looked at in terms of how you plan locally as well as nationally. And then there are the other generations, the ones after the baby boomers. I particularly identify with the millennials because they're my kids. But what is their relative prosperity going to be? What is their income potential, the debt they have incurred to try to have a future professionally, and how that impacts the economy? And the choices they make, the demands they'll have, the lifestyles they'll lead are going to actually very much impact what we have to deal with in terms of land use and accommodating other generations. There have been some who have said, will there be a reaction to new urbanism? The idea of bringing people closer together, densifying, will it have, in fact, a result that leads people to look to escape because they're looking for areas that are less populated? So that's something we may have to address as well. And some extent we are today. And I'll close by saying money will be a huge issue for the future. It's about income and how it's distributed and how there's equity and what that means for people and their ability to live each day and choices they make in the marketplace and where they live, but also what it means for public resources. Can we see a future where taxation is going to be of greater reliability, or is in fact going to be of less reliability? We know how things have been going in the past few years. Are we moving towards user fees and the need to try to accommodate with a system that's more of that basis? And someone actually had mentioned maybe it'll be crowdsourcing that ends up funding what we do. So with that, I'll close and let others talk.
Thank you, Wayne. Interesting thoughts. Missy? One of the things I mentioned, I think I did to the panel members, if somebody has stolen your thunder, you can say that he shared or she shared what I was thinking about, but it may also precipitate thoughts that will deviate from what you had already put pen to paper. So, Missy?
Well, we definitely did some preparation on our end. Jenny and I talked about this last week, and I shared this question with my staff as well. So some of the items that I have to bring up are on the more specific end, so they don't cross over completely with where Wayne is, but all of the things that Wayne talked about are things that are definitely going to be very important. And I'm not going to hit on all of the things that I have listed here because I want Jenny to have some opportunity in case we had some crossover. But if something gets missed by the end, I'll make sure that I communicate that to you guys. There are a number of things that, that time frame from now that we're going to have to be looking at that we're probably just on the cusp of looking at right now. One thing would be urban agriculture. Now, that's not going to apply to everyone necessarily, but, we have this, we're moving backwards, which I don't consider it backwards, I consider it more sustainable. But, people are more interested in keeping animals and having fresh eggs and, goats and chickens and different kinds of animals, having those in urban areas. And how does that work with everything else? There are an awful lot more people, and we have to look at the impacts of what that's going to be and how that can work within that framework. One thing we've had some experience with is garden plots. There's vacant lots in localities, and people are interested in putting gardens there. Well, there are impacts that come along with that, and we have to look at that. There's waste that comes from gardens. There's also the commerce end of it. How is that being handled? We have one way of handling it. Maybe in the future it'll be completely different. But things that are surrounding urban agriculture are definitely going to be considerations as we are continuing forward. The definition of industry. Industry, when you think industry, you think what? I know most folks think smokestacks. Well, we don't have an awful lot of that occurring right now. There's some that's very specialized and there will be that factor, but in most localities, we're not looking at that. We're looking at a different kind of industry that doesn't have necessarily the external impacts in the same way that traditional industry has. And so that's a very important thing for looking at how that may change your land use plans into the future. Aging population. I'm going to touch on this only because one of kind of the terms out there in the aging literature is the silver tsunami, which is the boomer generation, and how at 2025 we're going to be in the middle of that. And things are going to be different. And we're not going to know exactly how different they're going to be until we're in it. But it's definitely something that there are a lot of people looking into and a lot of people planning for. And it's something that we need to have on the horizon because we haven't experienced a time exactly like that in the past. Let's see, I'll pick on one or two more here. Health aspects. That's something that's dear to my heart because I was a health planner as well as a land use planner. And to me, it never seemed like rocket science to connect the two. And over the last number of years, we've had a lot of work being done on how your environment affects the health of your community. And I'm sure you all see that in the media all the time now, that these connections are being made about if you can't get somewhere but on foot, then your community is a lot less likely to have healthy aspects going on. And so that's something that's kind of an aha kind of thing, but thank goodness that's really big in the planning right now. Food access, that's another thing Wayne got into, so I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I totally agree with that. And then requirements for government collaboration. You all saw a presentation Elaine and I put together. I don't not exactly know what she presented, but it probably was bits and pieces of what we have done over the last few years with our livability project. As of our last comp plan, a couple years back, from a transportation standpoint, each locality was dictated a number of things from a transportation standpoint that need to be in your comprehensive plan. I can foresee a time where that's even broadened further, where there are specific requirements for collaboration between adjacent localities. What that'll look like, I don't know, but I definitely can see that if anyone's on the proactive end of that you're going to be in a better place working with your neighbors on that. Okay, I'm going to let others share some things, but I promise I'll share those other things if no one else does.
Good, thank you, Missy. Bruce?
I'll share 3 points with you that are cross-cutting of what you've heard thus far and also very concrete in terms of specific proposals. The first is that when we redo our plans in 2025, we add a chapter on change, because I would maintain that we're looking at unprecedented changes and that the pace of change has quickened, and the change is happening in all sectors and all topics. We need to pull that together and see what the combined effect is. So my modest proposal is that we add a chapter on change. I would have a requirement in the state legislation that I would write of 4 sections. One would be planned negative changes. You might say, well, how could that be? I'm thinking, as a local example, the impacts of construction of a new grade separation in the midst of a busy highway corridor in a commercial area that will have some adverse impacts. So that's planned, but it's negative. So we need to plan on how to mitigate and how to cope with that. So that's one category. A second is spontaneous negative. Climate change, sea level rise, those will happen. They're beyond our control, but what do we do in the face of those kinds of changes? We probably study them at this point. We try to trace out different scenarios. We don't know enough yet to be maybe more concrete than that, but we need to start. Then there's spontaneous positive changes. That would be things like initiatives of the private sector and individuals that improve the community. There I would say what we need to do is get out of the way and facilitate them, because those kinds of things will happen too. And the last is planned positive, which is of course what we think all of our actions are. And when we do that, I would say what we need to do is, what are our strengths? Focus on our strengths, make strategic investments so that those kinds of strengths are part of a very positive change for the future. So that's my first proposal, a new chapter on change, and we do this in 2025. The second proposal is another new chapter. It's what I call the extended time horizon chapter. Forever, we've planned 20 years ahead. My suggestion is we need to, in addition to that, plan 50 years ahead. 20-year planning is the new mid-range planning. 50 years ahead is the new long-range planning. We'll still have the comp plan looking at 20 years. We'll still have the CIP, 5 to 6 years. We'll have annual budgets and so forth. And much of the action that we're actually taking will continue to happen in that 20-year time frame. But for several reasons, I think we need to look beyond that. And I'll just mention a couple of those. One is consistency. One of the things I noticed locally is that our regional water supply plan uses a 45-year time horizon. So we're providing water 45 years out, but we're not thinking about what are the land uses 45 years out. When we do infrastructure planning, we tend to plan longer than 20 years. Why aren't we in our comp plans looking beyond that? So don't abandon the 20 years. Think of that as mid-range instead at the 50-year. That way we'll be consistent perhaps with some of the infrastructure plans. The other reason is that in times of instability, as I think our coming period will be, you need to sort of look out at the horizon and see what might be coming at you. You may not recognize it, you may not quite know what it means, but looking out 50 years, think of the buildings that are being constructed today. 50 years from now, they'll qualify potentially for historic status. Think of our infrastructure that's 50 years older, our bridges, our roads, our water and sewer systems, and so forth. So I think that there's some real gains from that, and so that's my second modest proposal as a chapter on extended time horizon. The third is more of a process consideration, which is, I'm calling it cultivate constituency and ownership. I'm not calling it public involvement or participating the public, but I'm calling it cultivating constituency and ownership. Because when change happens and we look to the long-term future, change will polarize. Change will stress people and groups and places in the community. And we need a way to have people believe in the plan and advocate for it and defend it. And that doesn't just happen by having a public hearing. That happens by giving people meaningful ways to be involved in the creation of the plan so that they feel ownership and therefore become defenders of the plan and sort of watchdogs for its future. And locally, the way that's being done is citizen advisory councils. Once the comp plan is done, then master plans are done for sub-areas in the community. And there's a citizen advisory council associated with each of those master plans. Those people believe in those plans. They help to create them. They will question you if you start to depart or it appears that you depart. And that also gives a way for people to realize that planning is not done when the plan is done, but to continue to review projects that come into their area, to continue to monitor their data. And so it's a way of building constituency and creating ownership. So those are my three cross-cutting and hopefully concrete ideas. Thank you.
Excellent. Jenny Keller, Charlottesville Planning Commission.
Well, it's truly amazing how much alike we all are. And Bruce being a professor, I boiled it down to three, and I have 7 themes, but very similar to what Wayne introduced and everyone else has gone, but I'll just go with it. And mine have probably as much to do with process as they do with product. I believe in 2025, we will have need for more formal cooperation and direct planning collaborations with our nonprofit and for-profit partners in areas that we've traditionally been interested in, and perhaps some of the newer areas such as energy, but I would also add economic development, housing, and particularly in areas that I'm interested in as a preservation planner, historic preservation and the environment. And not just avoidance, as was mentioned earlier, but or destruction, but also how to work within those contexts in the future. Of course, we've talked a lot today about interjurisdictional cooperation. I think that will be very important, as Elaine and Missy have talked about, and in more formal ways than we have now. I also believe that in 2025 we will do more macro planning and more micro planning. Already in Charlottesville, we're targeting small area plans, so we're looking in detail at specific areas of our city, and I think we'll continue to do that. I think we'll also look at special interest areas in 2025. I don't know exactly what they would be, but using today's information, they would probably be arts districts, entertainment districts, market districts, and of course the traditional historic district. And as a preservation planner, I think we will be in 25 looking at incorporating into our process the new ways that are developing now of documenting, evaluating, and treating historic properties, because we will have so many properties that are eligible for the National Register, and we're coming up on the reauthorization of the Preservation Act nationally, and also tax reform, things that will dramatically change the way historic properties are viewed. I really think that regional initiatives will be important. I sit on the Planning District Commission, and things are starting to bubble up now, and we've had a session about the ways that we can legally cooperate. I think that will be especially important in terms of transportation, housing, recreation, agriculture, food security, and food sourcing, as people have talked about. I would add to that we probably will need to incorporate disaster planning into our comp plans. With the increasing intensity of weather and other events, it probably is not something that will just be left to the experts, but there will be a plan in place and everyone will be aware of that and know what to do. Wayne talked about smart roads and smart cars, especially timely in this week with the Google car coming out. I read that self-driving cars will be on our roads by 2025 at the latest. Mercedes, Nissan, and Volvo are all indicating a high level of autonomy by 2020. And Google has indicated its aspiration to have technology in public hands sometime between 2015 and 2019. So that will have tremendous implications for how we plan our communities. So much of our planning has been about cars and parking, so this will dramatically change that landscape and how we plan for vehicles, what it means for a retail environment, for the work environment. It's just hard to tell. I think along with that, the sixth theme is planning for the new, more integrated ways that we live now, that we blend life, work, play, health. All of these together will be more and more integrated in the places that we do them. So what does that mean for traditional zoning, the neighborhood, places of work, in-migration to cities, and the more dispersed patterns that Wayne talked about. Everyone's mentioned aging. Of course, that will really mean something for us, along with more deaths, perhaps fewer births in the future. What does that mean in terms of housing, universal design? Dramatic income disparities. I mean, that's something we definitely see in Charlottesville, and it will probably only solidify more in jurisdictions all over the state. Finally, I think we need an increased recognition that we live in an information age, and already our plan that we've just done in Charlottesville has links that can be updated all the time. I think the public will demand information in real time. We won't be able to get away with using 10-year-old data, 20-year-old projections. The public will just demand that be updated almost in real time on the spot. The same with communication. What will a public hearing look like in 2025? I would imagine that it would be somewhat of a virtual experience, and that communication and interaction will be very, very different in 2025, and we'll have to build that into our planning process. Bruce talked about planning for change. I would also add planning for continuity will be really important in 2025, and when we have such drastic change, we need to build in ways that people can confidently find their way in this brave new world. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. I believe Will is next.
Just have a 27 themed presentation for the next 3 minutes. And they're developed. You all have hit on a lot of these topics. I just wanted to emphasize a couple that I thought, at least I was most passionate about. I'll say number one for me is hazard mitigation, as a few folks have said. It's pretty evident that the weather has been a little more extreme in recent years, depending on what you subscribe to in terms of the reasoning. I don't think matters as much as the fact that it's happening. And so, we certainly do that to a certain extent already. After the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, we've had to do regional hazard mitigation plans. Virginia normally done through the PDCs. But I would argue that that's not good enough. I think it really needs to be integrated through all of the chapters and themes of your comprehensive plan. As planners, what better role is there for us than to prepare the most catastrophic events that can possibly happen in our communities. And I think it's a lesson that people have a hard time learning. Just recently, Hurricane Sandy just tore through the East Coast, and I remember watching CNN, and the governor up in New Jersey was on the beach up there on the Jersey Shore. And you know, again, recognizing such a tragedy that was, that storm. But I remember the words that he said in that speech. He said, "We're going to rebuild this exactly the way it was before." Exactly the way it was before. The same storm, 1973, I believe, was nor'easter that ripped through there. It hit the exact same spot on that beach. And they rebuilt it exactly the way it was before. And then just this last year happened again. And the statement was, we need to build it exactly the way it was before. And for all the tragedies that come with these disasters, there are opportunities as well. There's silver linings as well. And I'll say that is that you do have an opportunity to rebuild it better than what it was before. There's a silver lining there. Second, I'll say technology. Certainly technology is changing a lot. Lots of comprehensive plans look 20 years into the future. 20 years ago, I was wearing a giant starter jacket, high tops. I drove a car that had wood on it. I did not have a phone. If you wanted to meet with someone, you talked to them and planned it ahead of time. I can't believe I'm sounding like my parents already. I know, it's coming with age. But a lot of things have changed in the past 20 years. Just imagine what the next 20 years will hold. Certainly with the 1994, internet was not what it was before. But not only what are those changes, but what are the changes that's going to make the land use? That's a real important question. Commercial properties, do they need as much square footage now as they did 10 years ago? I would argue definitely not. I kind of scratch my head when I see these giant commercial buildings. Also, I believe it's Arlington County, they're going for their ordinance now to remove some uses such as the old Kodak processing centers with everyone with a phone in their pocket. We don't need those anymore. So looking at what impact that will have on land use. In terms of transportation, again, looking at funding, another issue with that, I believe, will be, I don't think anytime soon, but if someday the state decides they want to go down the road of devolution, and the localities have to take on, if not all the costs, some additional costs with roadways, that's certainly going to be a huge thing to think about in the future. Whether that will happen or not, we will see. Just one last point, not so much the issue, but more the format that is important to consider while addressing those issues is the fact that things are changing so fast. And I'm a strong believer that comprehensive plans that are brief and concise and attractive to people and really encourage them to read and use it is a very important tool. So you do a plan of 3 minutes to talk, there's no way that's going to happen. You're going to take up 5. And so I've done it myself so many times. I've written so many plans, and I've thought this is going to be great. It's 120 pages, one chapter. They're just going to love it, and it ends up on a shelf because it's so big. You just don't want to read that. So, and I think the county and the city with their comp plans did a great job with that. They really got it concise, and I think really great documents. So I think that's really exciting. And so that's all I got.
Thank you, Bill. Lad?
Thank you and good afternoon. And I've only spent 1 year in the public sector, so apologies if some of this is a little less feasible perhaps, more proactive, I like to think of it as. I want to take a little different tack in terms of not what comp plans should have or will have in the next 10 years, but what they should do, from my perspective at least. Starting with my perception working throughout the country and hearing citizens is that comp plans are under a lot of challenges right now. Challenges, it's not necessarily a bad thing, challenges can make us better, but you hear things like, why do we need one? It's too open to interpretation, doesn't have the force of law, or it's applied too rigidly or legalistically. It's not flexible enough, it's too flexible, criticism either way. And I think as a result of that, the best comp plans are getting back to their roots. They are proving their value to their customer, and at the same time, I think comprehensive plans are expanding their customer base. So who's the customer for comprehensive plans? I'm sure you have your ideas, but to me, it's an ever-expanding list. Savvy homeowners or developers that are trying to maximize their investments, a school or a military installation that's trying to understand the future of its neighbors. With this getting back to the roots thing, to me, staying on the theme of threes, I think there's three things that comprehensive plans in the future will need to do. One is reestablish their value in the political marketplace. We're getting a lot of new legislative tie-ins to comprehensive plans from above and from below. So from above, things like VDOT Chapter 527 regulations, which require review of comprehensive plans. From below, things that panelists have talked about that didn't used to be in comprehensive plans, the bike ped plan, the local foods plan, things like that. These are a good thing ultimately. I think they're strengthening the comp plan. It's giving it a little more legal mandate as an expression of policy. The more they're intertwined with enabling legislation and local regulations, I think they'll be stronger, and that will grow their political capital, if you will, in the political marketplace. So one is value in the political marketplace. Two is the economic marketplace, reestablishing their value in the economic marketplace. What do you think comp plans and zoning were created to do? People have opinions on that, but to me they were done to protect our investments at their very root. That's changing though, as the threat of a slaughterhouse next door to a luxury housing complex becomes less relevant. How do we reestablish this value that they have economically? One thing I'm seeing is tie-ins to the local economic development plans, tie-ins to federal grant programs like SETS, Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. Those are particularly important in areas that were hard hit in the recession. One example, in Winchester, the comprehensive plan really did away with land use categories and started looking very strategically at policy areas. So areas they wanted to catalyze, areas they wanted to stabilize or revitalize became kind of their policy districts within the comprehensive plan. I think this is the future of comprehensive planning, particularly in built-out communities that want to proceed strategically and have tie-ins to their economic strategy. And then finally, I think reconnect with its customer base, talk about who our customers are. But to me, a comprehensive plan's customer is anyone who's interested, to whom it's relevant. Without interest or relevance to the average person, it just becomes a dry housekeeping document. You know, it's printed on dead trees and it gathers dust if it doesn't have relevance. What I see places like Nashville and Orlando are doing is engaging with this Web 2.0, this interactive process with the web community. So tools like MindMixer or MetroQuest take the comp plan into that interaction, give people a platform to have that interaction outside of the public meetings or in addition to the public meetings. They talked about the internet becoming this electronic agora, this marketplace of ideas, and I think that's a real potential in comprehensive plans. It's symbiotic with the public meetings so that the web presence drives traffic to the public meetings drive traffic to the web, and you get ultimately more participation. I think that's the way that public discourse is evolving, and comp plans, I think, have to engage that to survive. So in conclusion, I think we may be facing kind of a new golden age of comprehensive planning as it goes back to its roots, and as we think of them less as this kind of static artifact or legislative mandate, and more as kind of this living, breathing dialogue, an ongoing dialogue. And I think with that, the future could be very bright for comprehensive plans. So thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Matt. Mr. Sutton.
Why there's a danger in going first, there's also a danger in going last. I'll take credit for Wayne's remarks. Yes, I too came when he was just so little. Just
They made you late.
Yeah, well, you know. One of the things that occurs to me in listening to these, I'm not going to add to the list, but just some observations, I guess. Seems to me if we all took notes on that, you know, we've got some pretty good grist for a regional dialogue. And we talked earlier about the need to communicate with our neighbors. Many of these issues, if not all of them, are regional in nature. And you go back to what my comments were before about what are the threats and the opportunities. This is a list of challenges or things to begin to consider, and it might begin that regional dialogue should people be interested in doing that. Second, when you combine these together and you go through that regional discussion, I think there's the opportunity for coming out of that, you know, a collective approach on agreed objectives or needs for things to address. I don't know exactly how that transforms itself. But it sets the tone for maybe an element in the plan that I guess Charlottesville and Albemarle already did when they synthesized their plans together. We did that in the metropolitan area of Washington, where you try to envision, you put together a plan in similar categories. And that also begins the dialogue of where we similar, where we different, and really more importantly, what are our present opportunities. I know that many in Virginia are struggling with the Tea Party input into the process. Are many of you still feeling that same involvement? Has it subsided any? I see some no. I see, well, I'm going to add to perhaps what might be stimulus for them to continue. We talked a lot about demographic issues. We talked about a lot about the challenges for our young people getting jobs, the aging population, the difference in earnings and capabilities, the difficulties in housing. There's this whole area of social planning that we probably need to be careful what we call it. But those factors are things that we should be addressing our physical development to in a way that we can be supportive of it, or a programmatic development. And that may be new to the physical aspects of planning, but I would remind us all that the purpose of planning, in my view, maybe even somewhat in the code, is planning for the health, welfare, and well-being of the present and future population. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. What I mentioned to the panel members was after we heard from one another, we would then have an opportunity maybe for discussion, dialogue between the individual panel members, maybe reactions to what they heard from one another. Anything jump out? One of the things that struck me was, and maybe it's the academic orientation, because I've all along thought that there ought to be I always say, if I could play God, these would be the mandated elements in the comprehensive plan, these would be the code. So Bruce was pulling at the heartstrings there. But reactions to what Bruce suggested. My assumption is that panel members you were listening to the good doctor, okay? Anybody? Yes. Yeah.
Talk loudly.
Yeah, no, the microphone will work here if push that button. There you go.
Thank you. I wanted to speak to the 50-year planning time horizon, and I think ever since I was in school, I think that's been kind of the holy grail of planning. You know, that's just something that we as planners, generally longer is better for the time horizon. But you see the opposite kind of reaction nowadays. I've been told that 20 years is way too nebulous for people, and 5 years, and focus on the short term, maybe have a chapter in the back about the long horizon. So I don't know here nor there, but that's definitely against the trend that I'm seeing.
Bruce, you might want to comment, because I know that's something you advocate, but you also are very much grounded in the real world, despite being in the academia world.
Well, one of the themes that two of the panelists, Jenny and Will, mentioned were disaster planning and hazard mitigation.
Yeah.
It strikes me that that might be the thing that brings together sort of the immediate and the long term to convince people that, you know, that things that haven't happened before could nonetheless happen here. And we can look at concrete examples, specific places, and the problems they've had. I think that, you know, there really is a challenge in preparing those kinds of plans. It's not just sort of a cookie cutter kind of thing. It takes training even after you've prepared the plan, and the plans need to be kept up and so forth. So that might be a way to interest people who say, well, we need to focus on the immediate, and people who say we need to look way down the road. That might be a middle ground.
It does, and it would feed into your suggestion about change and change management. Change is going, in a lot of respects, comprehensive planning, over the 40 years of being in the business, kind of have settled on the idea that really what planning is about change and trying to anticipate the change that's likely to occur, and how are we going to position ourselves to capitalize on that change, which is inevitable. So change management is important. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's going to put us on the front end of things. One of my staff folks sent me an article. There is a lawsuit going on in Indiana right now where some insurance companies have sued a number of localities because they felt that they shouldn't have to pay the claims for flood damage. They felt that the locality should have taken care of the things that that created the floods in those cases. And so, you know, going back and forth in just the little article that I read about this, you know, the localities are saying, well, what, we can't control Mother Nature, and the insurance companies are saying, well, you all need to do better. And so, you know, that's just a case of us talking about it now on the front end and trying to get a handle on it before we get into a situation.
We know that the river floods on occasion. We know the science of what we call 1, 2 year, 5 year, 10-year storms. And we know if we get a fair amount of snow in certain parts of our nation, when that snow melts in the spring, that adds volume to a river. So kind of back to Will's point about, you know, who doesn't want to live right on the ocean front, but storms occur, we get blown away or torn down, or Mother Nature does her thing, then we come right back and say we're going to rebuild. Should we be doing that? Maybe the insurance company is saying you can't control Mother Nature, but you can control how close to the river body and the flood plain of said river at certain effects in terms of occasional storms shouldn't allow development in close proximity to the water. Of course, then we bump up as planners against people who want to live and don't want to sacrifice their property and be 600 feet from the water. Art, me?
Yeah, Vladimir commented on something I'd like to hear more about. He made a passing reference to Nashville, Amanda, and I may have misunderstood, but I'll tell you my reason for asking, and I think paid staffers in the room can identify with this. I've had the experience of reading a comprehensive plan, more than once. There may have been 125, 150 pages. Read it, gone back, taken notes, reread parts, and sit in a room with maybe a dozen people who represent the leadership of the community. And there might be 1 or 2 people in that room who've also read it, and maybe they had prepared by a professional 4 or 5 years before, and nobody in the room is really familiar with it. And it sounds like to bridge, because I've wondered, like, how do you get people to read this stuff? And like, is Nashville and Orlando, and other speakers touched on the internet, and Bruce, I think, touched on how long some of these documents are and some of these elements. Are they finding a way to bridge that gap in this ever increasingly busy society?
I'd like to follow up.
Just briefly, great question. Neither of their plans are done yet, but what I was referring to was, to me, if by the time the plan is out there, it's too late to get people interested in reading it. And what these processes are, like Mind Mixer, for example, which we're using in a couple of communities, every week or two, it gives you new questions, and it builds this interest level over several months of the process, especially before the meetings. And it says, what do you think of your community? What do you think of the plan? What do you, that's what people are expecting nowadays, particularly the ones on their smartphones and things like that, to constantly be prompted with new questions. So by the time you get a document, you've got a base of interested people that do want to read it.
This fall at our conference in Short Pump, we're going to, Milt Hurd's already been working on it, maybe he's already talked to Vlad. We're going to have a couple of sessions that are going to be looking at planning in the cloud. And basically it's going to be the Mind Mixer and other technology and how we should utilize that technology, and is that technology another way to connect planning with the customer and then to get the customer buying it. Because we're not going to be just coming to meetings anymore as people, okay? Yes?
As part of that, can you get Milt maybe to work on education for public officials to allow staff to actually use the social media?
We have our certification program for county supervisors. Class meets tomorrow in Charlottesville. They got to sign up. That's a real question. It's germane because we don't want to get so far ahead of our elected officials. We need to make sure the elected official is with us, so to speak. They are one of your customers, clients, either as staff or as a PC member, and that's a topic for another day. But that's an important component when we think about, and several of the presenters talk about connecting the planning or the planning process with its client base. And one of the important clients is the elected official. And what he or she brings to the task is going to color this whole enterprise, as we know. Other maybe reactions internal to the panel with each other. Yes, Missy?
I was going to talk about length of comp plan, because that came up as well.
Thank you.
We tried something this time, and we'll see how it goes over time. Our comp plan was adopted in August, and it's the shortest comp plan I've seen in a long, long time. What we did is we wanted to make it as web-based as possible. And so our key portions of the comp plan have to do with each of the chapters as well as their goals and objectives. And then we have everything else as appendices. And so we have a booklet. It's pretty small. It's like this big. That's our comp plan. So if somebody wants to come in and get a paper copy of the comp plan, it's about that big. If they want to go online and look at it, it's right there online. They can look at just it's like 30, 40 pages, that part of it. But say you've got somebody, they're really into the environment and they're really into finding out what you're doing with stormwater. They can click a link and they can go to tons and tons of data about how we got to where we got in the meat of the comp plan. But if somebody's not interested in that, they're more interested in housing, then they can click that link instead. And so we've gotten the stuff that goes out, just the bulk of it, down to something that somebody can handle, and it's interesting and colorful, and folks can really grasp that. But if they want to dig deeper, we've got it there for them. They just want to see it all at once.
That's and I think we have some examples in the room. Some have some years on them. I know at the Loudon Enterprise of the early 90s, it was a 300-some page document, but there was a nice, what you then call executive summary. Art's point about reading through even if it's 125 pages, and the real essence is, the 122 to 125, maybe we need to flip it around. Blacksburg, years ago, we've got Steve Huntley still here and Karen Drake. I remember when we redid the comp plan there, systematically, you put the implementation as the first entree in the book. So it brought the attention of the reader to, this is our game plan, this is how we're going to get there. And I think Missy makes a great point. Have the comp plan, the essence of it, and then those who want to do the background reading, they can push the button, they've got, 500 pages. Jim, do you all, your plan, I guess, would stack up, be about 4 foot high and 80 pounds. Is there an executive summary these days? I know we tried to bring some of that about.
Actually not. But I think the difference in our plan, maybe not, is that one, the process, I think as Vlad was talking about, and is highly inclusive. Fairfax really can't do anything without a 50-person task force and then augmented by advisory groups. And in the process, it's not that you dump a draft on the table. I mean, you're starting with pretty much a fresh sheet of paper. And on top of that, the plan is very specific in terms of uses allowed on properties. And also very specific in terms of the design elements that we're expecting. And very specific with regard to the stormwater management expectations. And a variety of other issues. And the specificity is laid out there so that people understand what it is the obligations are. And if they understand what the obligations are, or the aspirations, I won't call them obligations, that's a zoning ordinance, but the aspirations are, and they know that this translates into our request for proffers and commitments and the like, there is then the debate created between those who are in favor of those and those who are not so much in favor of those, which leads to a full discussion of it and understanding of it as you build each one of these elements. The Tyson's plan, we had, after the 50-member task force self-destructed, we spent 20 months putting the plan back together with the Planning Commission Committee, open to everybody who had an opportunity to participate, went through it issue by issue by issue by issue. So that we're through, it's a lengthy process, I agree, but by the time you're through, you get back to, I think, what Bruce is talking about, and that is a constituency. One, some agreement in and around what the community would like to have happen. Some compromises occurred in that process. The developer or property owner's expectations are at least framed and considered. So you do have that extensive commitment that creates the advocacy. And, you know, that's the way we do it. There's some excitement and there's some risk in the plan. And when people react to that risk, they engage in a dialogue which ends up in people digging forward.
We actually have focused around the idea of giving people context for why you're doing what you're doing, because we've found users who generally are going to go to particular sections because that's the topic they're interested in. And then they may be asking the question, well, why are you doing this? So you really need to, I think, be able to make a statement in the beginning that tells people what you're trying to achieve ultimately. And that ties not only into the goals you have in your plan, I call it the vision for the community. And it's not only about that, but it's also about something that's well beyond the 20 years. This is getting back to Bruce's point. When you're visioning what your community, what you have collectively determined your community wants to be ultimately, that's beyond any time frame specific to the plan. It's beyond the 5-year review, but it's certainly the 20 years and even a 50-year potentially. It's really giving the context for why you're going where you're going and why the goals are important. We've actually structured our plan with each chapter's goal related directly to the vision and how that particular chapter and that goal are trying to help achieve that vision. And so I think it's part about context, and really it's not about expecting people and including the decision makers are going to read every page of the plan. It's more about them understanding what it is you're trying to achieve as a community.
It's a journey, is it not? When we think about a comprehensive plan, it's really a roadmap to a preferred future. And if we can settle on a consensus in terms of our preferred future, then we use the plan as a milepost, a guideline, and a process by which we arrive ultimately at that preferred future. And if you can, I remember again, Blacksburg, it was 1996, it was somewhat viewed humorously, but there was a portrait of 2046. Middle part of the plan was both pictorial and narrative of what you would be experiencing in the Blacksburg of 2046. And people would kind of scoff and say, we don't know what the hell tomorrow's going to bring. How can you see clearly 2046? You can't, but you can imagine it. And it's that power of imagination that can unite a community and then let that be the purposeful change that you're attempting to manage and guide yourself towards. Not everybody buys into that, obviously, but that does separate, when it's 50 years down the road, maybe me from my immediate backyard. You know, and that takes away that pressure of the here and now. And if we can arrive at that, that can be a powerful construct. Other comments for panel members, then we'll open up for a question or two from the audience, and then they can close her out. Jim?
Yes, just reacting to the 50-year horizon and plan, particularly in the areas of redevelopment. I'm thinking right now Tyson's, Merrifield, and the like in Fairfax County. To have the appropriate development occur with regard to maximizing, rail facilities or whatever, you're going to have very high densities. If the geographic area is large enough, such as Tyson's, you're going to be planning that property for 50 years or longer. It's going to take a long time for it to build out, but you shouldn't be planning for 20 years in terms of your allocation of growth, because you probably end up getting sued a lot. And you certainly don't want to suppress development to a level that 20 years from now it needs to redevelop again. So, that's just some support in some areas where it's necessary, I think, to go out and farm.
Now, how has that been viewed in your part of the world, Jim? Just sticking with you for a moment. You're what, 1.1 million people now live in the county of Fairfax?
There's, yes, 1.1 million and 680,000 jobs.
Yeah. Do you sense that's going to be changing anytime soon? Do you all, meaning, have you reached a saturation point, or do you all feel as a community you can absorb more? You're going to continue to be that magnet because of your location?
Participating in the metropolitan area planning, there's, of course, agreement as to what growth allocations must be. And we're forecasting a similar future as we have grown in the past. And our future, though, is up, not out. And that's another reason for planning or building the buildings that will be supportable 50 years from now.
Yeah, and that is also part of what's as a component of the build-out analysis or projected growth in Northern Virginia. And I think that extends to Loudoun County and Prince William, looking at the anticipated change in the metropolitan Washington area to the Council of Governments, and then Loudoun looking, for example, at what their fair share of that growth would be, and then how they would plan for that growth. A lot of people saying that runaway growth in Loudoun County, and, for a number of years, fastest growing unit of government in all of America. But really, the comprehensive plan called for and anticipated that growth. What maybe happened was that the timing of when that growth occurred got a little quicker out of the gate than they had anticipated, in part because the elected officials in the early 90s backed away from the notion that there would be a discrete timing and phasing when development would occur. But it's not runaway growth because it's planned growth. And that sometimes we think of Northern Virginia as, or Metro Atlanta, maybe not a valid comparison because Metro Atlanta doesn't have the planning tradition as in Northern Virginia. There is a rhyme to what's going on there, and it's anticipating more of the same, and now they're planning for it on that longer term horizon. Any other comments from the panel? Two panel members? Something from the audience? Yes, sir.
So, could you address the idea of using community strategic planning as a distinct exercise from comprehensive planning, but as a useful predicate to inform the comprehensive plan?
Strategic planning is a component of comp planning.
Were you directing that to me?
No, I just had something in my eye.
Well, this is something that in Charlottesville we've been concentrating on for the last year. We have a task force that's looking at particular areas, and so that we have steering committees for each of these areas that's populated by the task force, and also either experts in the field, say by PED, and people who live in the community. What we're hopeful is that we will learn lessons in each one of those specific areas that can be applied to the next one. And that will be an organic and evolving process. We won't apply the same methodology to each one, but we'll learn lessons that we take with us to the next one. And this week we've been looking, and Missy may talk about this more, about revising our code to deal with streets. I've been away, so I'm not exactly sure what has been presented this week, but that would be the kind of unifying thread that would tie all of these special interest areas, special geographic areas together. We're also looking at perhaps transitioning to form-based code for some areas, and we would be looking specifically to see how that would apply to distinct geographic and special interest areas of the city. It's not something that we can necessarily apply wholesale. We would have to tailor it for each one of those areas. Maybe Missy wants to weigh in there.
Just briefly, we have a street design charrette going on right now on the other side of the mall. And we have some folks in helping us try and prioritize what needs to happen on our streets. There's a community-wide focus on what happens between the buildings more so than the buildings themselves, which, you know, shouldn't be rocket science at all, but it's definitely a thinking method that is really come to pass here in Charlottesville and other places as well. And so we're trying to get input from the consultant with community input, because there's a lot of community public outreach portions of that, to figure out in our limited right-of-way how we allocate the space. And it's definitely not easy. We tried different exercises on our own, and different advocacy groups came in, and, you know, everyone wanted a piece of the pie, and there's not enough pie. Figure out whether you get the pie on this street or that street, and we're planning on that, framing some of a number of code audit exercises that we're going to be doing to try and upgrade our code, as well as we're looking at form-based code in specific areas of the city. So it's always a little bit of a moving target going on around here, but it's a work in progress. We're definitely on the front end of this discussion, so stay tuned.
And that approach actually touches on Bruce and other panel member comments about getting this product, this process back to the end user. You know, helping the public understand that there is a cause-effect relationship, and that when we're looking at a public space or a public realm, all of us have, you know, something to say about that, and that planning is not just broad swaths of colors on a map. We reduce it down to a block-by-block kind of adaptation, analysis, and end product. And so that's where I think we sometimes to find the interface between the comp plan, grand vision, and then the strategic plan as a way to make it happen on a smaller geography or geographic point.
Missy, that's been called modal competition
Yes.
in the right of way, and definitely feel the pain. We did, for the DRPT, we did guidelines for the state, and ended up with a system called modal emphasis to basically say complete streets, every mode is accommodated, but then certain ones are optimized based on community's choice of what they wanted to see in block by block.
And we're looking at some areas where there would be pretty intense, fairly dramatic change over 20 to 50 years. Other areas we're looking at more for, or will be in the future, more for neighborhood protection, where we might be just making minor changes and tweaking. So.
Yes, Patrick, maybe one more question after this. Go ahead, please.
So you folks have been tasked with peering into the future. So in 2025, when we post on the successor to YouTube our 5-minute comprehensive plans, will those comprehensive plans, and this is too early in the 50-year time frame, the plan for the northeastern megacity?
Interesting.
For the what?
The northeastern megacity.
It presumes one entity of government that controls the northeastern megacity. It may be a collection of plans.
Are we moving that farther west to accommodate climate change?
Yeah, not only are we talking about maybe planning collaboratively at the shared border, but then that raises the specter when an activity occurs in another state that maybe borders our state. Is geography, in fact, shrinking? In some respects it is, not in a physical sense, but what happens in Maryland or in a corridor of our nation will have a consequence. and other parts of the nation or in individual states. The whole issue of fracking, for example. Virginia may say no fracking. What if they're fracking in Pennsylvania? And Pennsylvania is the mother lode for the aquifer that we rely on for our water.
Well,
You
there's
might
also
say, well, that's
the-
in Pennsylvania, we ain't doing it in Virginia, but there's a potential consequence, because that pebble in that pond is going to have a ripple effect if something goes wrong with fracking in Pennsylvania or our water supply. So is that an issue that should be talked about between Pennsylvania and Virginia?
Well, we're all kind of in the middle of that right now with Chesapeake Bay regulations, because that touches almost everybody.
Yes, it does.
And it's multi-state, and there are different ways it's being handled, and I'm sure down the road they'll figure out which will be the best way, maybe.
So that
That's-
dialogue is already occurring, you're exactly right, Missy, but it's all part of this notion, and one of the reasons we settled on this as a topic was to, we all get caught up in the here and now, and the here and now is very, very important, but even as planners and planning commissioners and people who, by choice of profession or agreed to appointment to a public body like the planning commission, we're charged with anticipating tomorrow today. So it's important that we begin thinking about what we're doing and the consequence of our action in the future, but also be thinking about that future and how we're changing as a region, a county, a city, a town, or a state. So if we're not doing it on a more regular, rigorous basis, then who is doing it? And it may well be that conversation about the tomorrow we want will be the very thing that will excite the populace, be it face-to-face or be it through a handheld piece of machinery, that people will want to come and have that conversation, or will have that conversation from the comfort of their house or wherever with you in your office. Because the future is going to happen, and we hope, and we're not assured of what that future is going to be, but with confidence we can predict that the sun will rise and tomorrow is going to be Friday, May 30th. And it's up to us to decide how we're going to react to that reality. And because you and I possess the capacity to anticipate the future, even though we're not guaranteed presence in the future, we can proactively begin planning for what we want tomorrow to be. So that, I think, is both the power and promise of planning. And I think our panel has given us ample food for thought here this afternoon, and I want to thank each of you for your not only presence, but also your contribution. Thank you very much.